The scout helicopter found them first. Flying low and slow along a tree line south of Saigon, the little AH-1 Cayuse spotted movement in the brush that didn't belong there. A Viet Cong platoon caught in the open, still forming up for whatever they'd planned to do that night. The scout pilot keyed his radio and broke hard away from the position he'd just marked. He had exactly one job left to do: get clear before what was coming behind him arrived. 90 seconds later, a narrow, wasp-shaped helicopter unlike anything that had ever flown in a war before dropped out of the sky at over 150 miles an hour. Chin turret already tracking. Stub-wing rocket pods already armed. The Viet Cong platoon had perhaps 3 seconds of warning between the moment they heard the new sound and the moment the sound arrived directly on top of them. This was a hunter-killer team, and the killer half of it had a name that would outlive the war it was built for: the Cobra. To understand how Bell Helicopter built the deadliest gunship in Vietnam almost entirely on its own money, without the Army even asking for it yet, we have to go back to a design nobody in Washington wanted in 1958. Bell had tried this before and failed. In 1958, company engineers pitched a narrow-bodied gunship concept called the D-245 to an Army aerial reconnaissance unit, arguing that helicopters flying escort and attack missions needed a purpose-built airframe rather than a transport helicopter with machine guns bolted onto open cabin doors. The Army had no doctrine for armed helicopters yet, no clear mission requirement, and no budget line for a concept nobody higher up the chain had asked for. The D-245 died quietly. Bell kept the idea alive anyway. Funding continued design work internally through the early 1960s, with no guaranteed customer waiting at the end of it. By January 1965, with American ground forces about to deploy to Vietnam in serious numbers, and Huey transport helicopters about to start flying troops into landing zones with essentially no armed escort of their own, Bell decided to bet $1 million of its own money that the Army would eventually need exactly the aircraft nobody had ordered yet. Engineers stripped the Huey's mechanical guts. Engine, transmission, rotor system, largely unchanged, and built an entirely new airframe around them. A narrow fuselage barely 3 feet wide, a tandem 2-seat cockpit with the pilot sitting above and behind the gunner rather than side by side, stub wings for mounting rocket pods, and a chin-mounted gun turret slaved to the gunner's own sighting system. The prototype, designated the Model 209, first flew on September 7, 1965. 8 months from a company-funded gamble to a flying aircraft. The Army, watching helicopter losses mount in Vietnam with no dedicated escort solution in sight, placed an order within 2 years. The first production AH-1 Huey Cobras reached Vietnam in September 1967, issued to the 334th Assault Helicopter Company. The unit's first platoon, nicknamed the Playboys, traded in their armed UH-1C gunships for the new aircraft and flew the type's first combat mission that October. The Cobra scored its first confirmed kill within days of arriving in country, sinking a Viet Cong sampan near Muk Hoa on a routine patrol mission, a modest debut for an aircraft that would go on to fly more than 1 million combat hours by the time American involvement in the war ended. What made the Cobra different from every armed helicopter that came before? It wasn't just speed. Though its top end of 171 miles an hour left the Huey gunships, it replaced looking sluggish by comparison. It was the entire design philosophy. Every previous armed helicopter in any air force on Earth had started life as a transport airframe with weapons added afterward. The Cobra started as a weapon platform first, with just enough airframe wrapped around it to keep 2 crewmen alive and the rotor turning. That narrow profile made the Cobra a dramatically smaller target for ground fire than the Huey gunships it replaced, while the armored tandem cockpit gave the pilot, seated high and to the rear, and the gunner, seated low and forward with direct control of the chin turret, independent sightlines that let both men fight the aircraft simultaneously rather than splitting. A tension between flying and shooting, the way a single pilot gunship crew had to. Weapons. Loadouts varied by mission but typically combined. A chin turret carrying either a 7.62mm minigun, a 40mm automatic grenade launcher, or both in a twin configuration, alongside stub-wing pylons carrying pods of 2.75-inch Hydra rockets, sometimes exceeding 50 rockets per aircraft, depending on configuration. A single Cobra making one firing pass could deliver a combination of high-explosive rocket fire and sustained automatic weapons fire that no ground fire team, however well dug in, could easily survive without cover thick enough to stop both. Later variants added the BGM-71 Tau anti-tank missile, extending the Cobra's role well past close air support and into a genuine tank-killing platform, though that addition came after Vietnam and found its real proving ground in later conflicts. The tactic that made the Cobra genuinely feared, though, wasn't really about the aircraft alone. It was the hunter-killer team, a pairing between a small, quiet scout helicopter, typically the AH-1 Cayuse, or later the AH-58 Kiowa, and one or more Cobras flying at higher altitude, out of sight, waiting for the scout to find something worth killing. The scout pilot flew low and slow, deliberately inviting ground fire to reveal a hidden position, functioning almost as bait while his own door gunner or observer marked the target. The moment contact was confirmed, the scout broke hard away from the position, and the waiting Cobra rolled in from altitude with rockets, minigun fire, or 40mm grenade launcher rounds, arriving with almost no warning for troops who had just fired on what looked like an unarmed, vulnerable target seconds earlier. At night, Cobra crews ran a specific mission profile known as Firefly, pairing the gunship with a helicopter carrying powerful searchlights or flare-dropping capability. Flares or searchlights illuminated suspected enemy movement below, and the Cobra attacked whatever the light revealed before the exposed troops could scatter back into cover. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces operating at night. Historically, one of their greatest tactical advantages against American ground units limited by darkness, found that advantage directly challenged by an aircraft that could see them just as clearly as daylight, allowed and respond within seconds. The 1968 Tet Offensive became the Cobra's first true large-scale combat test, arriving in-country barely months before North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks against cities and military installations across South Vietnam simultaneously. Cobra gunships flew close air support and armed escort missions throughout the offensive's chaotic urban and rural fighting, providing exactly the kind of fast, precise, on-call firepower that ground commanders needed as combat erupted in dozens of locations at once. Often faster than fixed-wing tactical air support could be scrambled and directed onto target. None of the Cobra's speed or narrow profile made it invulnerable to the specific dangers ground fire posed in Vietnam. Pilots flying escort missions over active landing zones absorbed small arms and light anti-aircraft fire on nearly every mission that mattered, and the aircraft's armored cockpit, while a genuine improvement over the open doors of a door gunner Huey, still left rotor systems, tail booms, and engine components exposed to exactly the kind of damage that brought down roughly 300 Cobras over the course of the war. Crews accepted that exposure as the trade-off for a role no other aircraft in theater could perform quite as well. Escorting troop-carrying Hueys into landing zones hot enough that an unarmed transport helicopter alone stood a meaningfully worse chance of making it back out. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. The aircraft. Nobody in Washington ordered, built anyway. If that's why you're still here, you already know what to do before the next one goes up. That escort mission mattered as much to Cobra doctrine as the hunter-killer role ever did. A flight of troop-carrying Hueys approaching a contested landing zone routinely brought Cobra gunships along, specifically to suppress ground fire in the critical seconds before, during, and immediately after touchdown, when a slowing, hovering transport helicopter represented the single most vulnerable target on the battlefield. Cobra pilots learned to read a landing zone the way an infantry officer read terrain, anticipating likely ambush positions along the tree line and suppressing them preemptively rather than waiting for the first shots to reveal where the danger actually was. By the war's end, more than 1,100 Cobras had served in Vietnam, flying in Army colors almost exclusively, since the Marine Corps would not receive its own twin-engine Cobra variant until years after American withdrawal. Roughly 300 were lost to combat and operational causes combined, a serious toll, though notably every single Cobra that survived the war was eventually shipped back to the United States for refurbishment into later production models. A fate, the Huey, thousands of which were simply left behind or scrapped in place, never received. The distinction reflected exactly how the Army viewed the two aircraft by 1973. The Huey had been an essential, expendable workhorse. The Cobra had been the answer to a problem nobody but Bell Helicopter had bothered to solve, years before the Army ever formally asked the question. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces adapted their own tactics, specifically around the hunter-killer threat, once its pattern became recognizable. Units learned to hold fire against a lone scout helicopter, even when a clean shot presented itself. Recognizing that revealing a position to bait a scout was exactly the trap the tactic depended on, and that the real threat was never the small, seemingly vulnerable aircraft flying low over the tree line, but whatever was orbiting unseen above it. That adaptation, in its own way, was the clearest evidence of how effective the tactic had become. An enemy force choosing to absorb a survivable ambush opportunity, rather than risk triggering a response it had learned, often at serious cost, that it could not survive. The aircraft's own limitations eventually caught up with it in the jungle heat and altitude of Vietnam's Central Highlands, where a single Lycoming turboshaft engine sometimes struggled to deliver full power on hot days at high elevation, a constraint that would eventually drive Bell to develop a twin-engine variant for the Marine Corps years later. Pilots who transitioned from Cobras to the AH-64, Apache decades afterward, often summarized the relationship between the two aircraft with the same blunt line. The Apache fixed everything that had been wrong with the Cobra, and every pilot who'd flown both knew exactly which problems they meant. None of that diminished what the Cobra had actually done in Vietnam. It had proven, in less than 2 years from a company-funded gamble to a combat debut, that the future of helicopter warfare belonged to an aircraft built to fight from the very first rivet, not a transport helicopter asked to fight because nothing better existed yet.